Returning to the Senate is in many ways like having a chance to relive a part of your life, and yet doing so with the benefit of experience that I gained in serving in this body before and also from service in the private sector. And it allows you to see things differently than you saw them before. And while I've discussed with my colleagues what is the same here in the Senate on return, there's also much that has changed in our country and that I think will mandate change in this institution. It's what has changed that has brought me back to the Senate, because the more that I witnessed what was happening to our country, the more I realized that I, like many others across the country, needed to re-engage in some way or another in the task of returning our nation to its basic values and time-tested principles. Not the least of which, I think, is returning our federal government to one that ensures a healthy fiscal nation, whose finances and policies promote job opportunities for its citizens. I just could not get comfortable with the fact that my generation might be the first generation to turn over a country in worse fiscal shape and with less opportunity to our children than one that we had the privilege of inheriting. When I first came to Congress in 1981, one of the very first votes that I had to deal with, and it was a tough one, it was to raise the national debt limit to just over the $1 trillion mark. Think of that. For nearly 200 years, as our country prospered and grew financially, we spent into debt $1 trillion worth of debt. Now, as a newly elected member of the House of Representatives, the last thing I wanted to do was, particularly having run on a campaign of limited government and trimming the size of government and spending, to then make one of my very first votes one to raise the national debt to accommodate excessive spending. On the almost impossible to say no request of then the newly elected President Ronald Reagan, who said we need to pay the past bills so that we can get to the job of cutting spending and cutting taxes and getting our country back on the right track economically. And so I gritted my teeth and swallowed hard and made that first vote. It is difficult for me today to comprehend that I'm standing here just 30 years later, and we are looking at a national debt of over $14.5 trillion. So in just 30 years, we've gone from $1 trillion to $14.5 trillion. I cannot comprehend that number. I think very few Americans can comprehend that number. But clearly, one thing stands out, and that is that this federal government has grown faster and much deeper into debt than any of us could have possibly imagined, and over a very short period of time. We have paid a steep and will pay an even steeper price tag for that debt, and it threatens our way of life as well as our nation's security. During the 90s, the combination of economic growth, the defeat of the 1993 health care plan, President Clinton's decision to move to the middle and support welfare reform all contributed to moving us toward a more sensible and fiscally responsible balance between revenue and spending. In fact, in 1998, we actually reached a surplus of about $69 billion, the first surplus reached since the year 1969. That would have been the ideal time to lock in a balanced budget amendment to ensure and hold Congress that we would not slip back into deficit spending, and that Congress and the White House would be held accountable for future spending. You know, there were two serious attempts during the 90s, both of which I supported, to enact a balanced budget amendment. They failed, each one by one vote. Think today where we would be fiscally. Had we gotten that one vote and passed either of those amendments, sent it to the states for ratification, which I'm sure they would have done, we would not be facing the dire fiscal situation that we face today. I have decided not to go into the details of our exploding deficits and debt. Much has already been said and published in that regard. Much has been said on this floor, and more will be said. Based on the last election, the American public is now much better informed of our current financial situation and the dangerous consequences of spending beyond our means. We have spent beyond our means in all areas of government. We have increased unfunded liabilities, and we have committed to programs which we cannot afford or sustain. Americans have heard the warnings of many who have analyzed our situation and sounded the alarm, and in 2010 said immediate action must be taken to avoid a national fiscal crisis of unprecedented negative consequences. What are those consequences? Ultimately, those consequences are a lower standard of living, less income for families to take home, to pay the mortgage, to buy that new car, to send their children, save money to send their children to school. Those consequences have, unfortunately, over the past couple of years, put our nation in a serious unemployment situation. People are out of work, and they've been out of work for months, if not years. Ultimately, it all turns down to jobs. Having the ability to bring home earnings that will sustain a family and provide opportunities for education, health, growth for those families, and give our children and our grandchildren and all those who follow us the opportunities that so many of us have enjoyed. Those are the consequences we face if we don't today address these problems. Many respected economists and financial experts have continued to issue dire warnings about our current fiscal condition, and let me quote just a couple of them. Erskine Bowles, the former chief of staff to President Clinton and co-chair of the President's Deficit Reduction Committee, said, "This debt is like a cancer that will destroy the country from within unless Washington acts." Pete Peterson, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce and Finance executive, said this about the national debt: "We need to ask ourselves, not just is this sustainable, but is it moral? What does it mean to burden our children to an unconscionable doubling of their taxes?" Admiral Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of our military, said, "I believe our debt is the greatest threat to our national security. If we as a country do not address our fiscal imbalances in the near term, our national power will erode and the costs of our ability to maintain and sustain influence could be great." And finally, former U.S. Comptroller General David Walker, who served under both Republican and Democrat administrations, has said, and I quote, "What threatens the ship are large, known, and growing structural deficits. Habitually spending more money than you make is irresponsible." But that is exactly what Washington has done. Habitually spend, sinking our fiscal ship deeper and deeper each year. We saw a drastic swing, as I have mentioned, in November. Hoosiers and Americans united together in a common purpose, demanding that our newly elected representatives and all representatives repair our fiscal health that's been destroyed by excessive tax and spend policies. They called for a change in course. They called for bold action today to preserve our country for tomorrow. They realized that the stakes are too high to ignore or delay addressing our fiscal challenges. Hoosier families and businesses, local communities, states, and virtually every other entity across Indiana and across our country have had to make sacrifices to trim their budgets. They are now calling for the federal government and for Congress to do the same. But, Mr. President, we cannot succeed unless we together, Republicans and Democrats, agree that addressing our current fiscal crisis requires political courage and bold action from both parties, both chambers of Congress, and President Obama. Mr. President, I'd like to offer what I think are some solutions that I believe Congress must execute, perhaps in a coordinated way, essential steps if we are serious about addressing the fiscal challenge before us. First, stop the fiscal bleeding and avoid economic distress by doing so. Washington has to break its habit of spending and borrowing addiction. Like curing any bad habit, it'll take discipline and it'll take commitment. As we consider spending cuts and ways we can reverse the growth of government, I believe everything must be on the table. All functions of government should be examined, including mandatory spending and defense spending. Serious discussions and proposals are currently underway in this Congress. I'm participating in many of them. These proposals need to be considered carefully, they need to be debated, and they need to be voted on. Secondly, I think it's important that we recognize that spending cuts alone will not solve our fiscal challenges and preserve our future. We need to pair our cuts with a pro-growth agenda that puts Hoosiers and Americans back to work. One of the ways Congress can achieve this goal is by reforming the tax code, by lowering marginal rates, by lowering corporate rates to make us more competitive with our competitors around the world, by eliminating exclusions and special interest deductions and credits, and simplifying the complex and convoluted tax code. Congress can help advance the economic recovery. This, I believe, is a necessary element in the task of returning to fiscal health. I currently am working on legislation on this very topic and hope to introduce it in coming weeks. Third, Washington needs to examine, reduce, and in many cases, eliminate harmful regulations and mandates. As I've traveled across Indiana, perhaps one story that I've heard over and over and repeats itself with every business I participate with or engage with, the word is regulations coming out of Washington, many of which do not reflect the will of the people, the will of Congress, but are imposed by non-elected bureaucrats, have put us at a disadvantage with our competitors, have added additional burdens of paperwork and compliance to us, and don't make sense from a health and safety standpoint. So oversight and proposals to address the regulatory burdens also need to be considered, debated, and voted on by this Congress. Fourth, I think we need to promote trade policies. 6,000 businesses in Indiana export overseas. 1/4 of all of our manufacturing jobs result from exports. So a good first step in all this process is to open our markets by approving the 3 pending trade agreements that we have: Korea, Colombia, and Panama. This will increase job opportunities at home, and this will put us on the path of continuing open trading that provides so many jobs to so many Hoosiers and so many Americans. Mr. President, having said all this, the greatest threat to our fiscal security is the growing and unsustainable mandatory spending. We cannot strengthen our country's financial health without addressing Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. These programs consume nearly 2/3 of the federal budget. And while we hear a lot of talk about the necessity of tackling entitlement spending, little action occurs because it's often considered too politically dangerous. However, I believe we no longer have a choice. We no longer can defer addressing these problems until after the next election. The entitlement crisis is before us and has been growing for several years. We know about the coming baby boom generation that's retiring and the impact it'll put on these entitlement programs. And we have to commit, I believe, to finding a way to restructure these programs and make them solvent. Let me repeat that. We're not here to undercut these programs. We are here to preserve those programs. We are here to make the necessary structural, long-term, incremental changes so that those benefits will be there for people when they retire. As Winston Churchill once said, one ought never to turn one's back on a threatened danger and try to run away from it. If you do that, he said, you will double the danger. But if you meet it promptly and without flinching, you can reduce the danger at least by half. We have not met this promptly, but I believe it's not too late to begin the process of making common sense adjustments to the current systems. Modest incremental changes now will help us avoid much more drastic and painful changes later. In 1983, the Congress was faced with a serious Social Security crisis. We were months away from having checks not sent out. Together, President Reagan, Tip O'Neill, majority and minority members of the Senate and the House, and the political leaders of the respective parties gathered together and decided to put this issue and the solution to this issue above politics. And they did so. And it was a difficult debate and discussion, but we made changes that were implemented on an incremental basis. Social Security bought 30 years of solvency on the basis of that decision. The sky did not fall, the economy did not collapse, and the people, when they learned why we were doing what we were doing, to preserve the program, not leave it in a dire situation where benefits would have to be cut or reduced dramatically, they backed what we did and supported. I believe we're in that position now with our entitlements. So if we can propose sensible, modest changes that will save these programs, I think the public will gladly support that. Mr. President, over the last decade, we have watched the storm clouds gather. And we've watched as those fiscal clouds have drawn ever closer and become ever darker. They are now bearing down upon us, and alarms are sounding louder than ever. As I have said, it is incumbent upon each of us in this Congress to acknowledge that the storm is here and to do all we can to mitigate the damage. But given the current division of authority in our Congress and executive branch, it is incumbent upon the two chambers and the two parties to succeed if we're going to address this current situation. It's incumbent to succeed that we will need to set aside the politics of 2012 for the future of our nation. And I believe the voters will respond favorably to that decision. However, no matter what we do as elected representatives, we cannot ultimately succeed without the engagement and the support and the leadership of the President of the United States. We know that the President understands the gravity of the fiscal crisis. As a former senator, as a presidential candidate, and now as Commander-in-Chief, he has clearly articulated his understanding of the issue. In 2006, then Senator Obama said, and I quote, "Increasing America's debt weakens us domestically and internationally. Leadership means that the buck stops here. Instead, Washington is shifting the burden of bad choices today onto the backs of our children and grandchildren. America has a debt problem and a failure of leadership." Those are the words of former Senator Barack Obama, now President of the United States. As a candidate for president in 2008, President Obama said, we're going to have to take on entitlements, and I think we've got to do it quickly. And in 2009, then President Obama said, what we have done is kick this can down the road. We are now at the end of the road and are not in a position to kick it any further. He also promised his administration would, quote, work with Congress to execute serious entitlement reform. Now, President Obama, as both Republicans and more Democrat members of Congress are committing to go forward, and as Republican and Democrat governors of states in fiscal peril are responding, our nation, Mr. President, our nation needs you now to assume the primary leadership role in helping us avert these financial problems and potential financial meltdown. The 2012 election must be subordinate to the urgency of the challenge before us. We cannot afford to wait until 2013 to begin the necessary work to prevent a fiscal disaster. We need presidential leadership now. Our country's future is at stake. Given the immensity of our fiscal challenges that we face today, some would say it's too late to remedy the problem. I do not hold that view. And I don't hold that view partly because, and primarily because, of our nation's history in rising to the challenge that faces us. From the founding fathers to George Washington, from Abraham Lincoln to Roosevelt and Reagan, times of trial and crisis have always produced moments of great leadership and the response of the American people to support that leadership. And that is what Americans are yearning for today, leadership. leadership to guide us out of this dangerous financial hole that threatens our nation's security and future. So I ask our president, as other presidents throughout our history have done in times of major threats, Mr. President, grant us your leadership. Grant us the leadership needed to restore the strength and prosperity that has been the American story and has allowed our nation to be the defenders and protectors of democracy and freedom. 30 years ago, Ronald Reagan delivered his first inaugural address and expressed the urgent need to rein in spending and curb the size and growth of the federal government. He said, "Doing so will require our best effort and our willingness to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to form great deeds, to believe that together with God's help, we can and we will resolve the problems that confront us." For each of us serving here today, I believe it is our duty to rise to the immediate challenge and resolve the problems which now confront us. It will take all of us uniting behind a common purpose that above all else, we must first restore and strengthen our fiscal security. We must articulate a clear vision, set specific goals, and make the tough decisions needed to bring our nation out of debt and preserve prosperity and opportunity for future generations. I am here today to commit to Hoosiers, to my colleagues, to my children and grandchildren, to all our nation's children and grandchildren, that I will not turn my back on our economic dangers or seek the false safety of political denial. I am standing here today to find solutions, to make the hard decisions, and leave behind a country that is stronger and more fiscally secure for future generations. This crisis is not insurmountable. We can overcome it by doing what great generations before us have done, mustering our will to do what's right. If we do, I know that America's greatest days are not behind us, but still lie ahead. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Republican leader.
Mr. President, not often in life does someone get a second opportunity to make a good first impression.